Floating shelves are a great way to enhance and add a bit of modern style to any room in your house. Creating floating shelves in your home is a fun DIY project that can have a lot of different uses, such as storage, interior design, and presenting family photos. The design of a floating shelf is to eliminate the need for any support brackets that can often be an eyesore. Floating shelves don't cost much at all, as all you'll need is some timber, screws, and paint. If you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Also, if you enjoy the video, why not subscribe and hit the like button. Today, to utilise this blank wall we have here, we're going to install 3 floating shelves. I used 138 by 42mm primed pine to create my floating shelves. I used 16mm timber dowels to connect the 2 sections of the floating shelves together. I used 100mm timber screws to attach the shelving to the wall. I painted the shelving firstly with a white paint primer and then finished it off with a semi-gloss white paint. I used a small amount of timber filler to fill the screw holes. The first step is to use a tape measure and 2mm level and go through and mark all the positions of the shelves onto the wall. The shelf width is going to be 1800mm. The shelves are going to be installed centered on this wall, which is going to give us 400mm spaces on each side. Our first shelf will be installed 1100mm from the floor to the top of the shelf. And then we're going to have 500mm spaces between the next 2 shelves. The next step is to go through and mark the frame and studs in this wall, so we have the locations on where we're going to install the fixings for our shelves. Using an electronic stud finder, I'll go through and mark the center of each timber stud location onto the wall. This is the location where I'll use the 100mm bugle headed screws to attach the first section of the floating shelf to the wall. Now the set out is completed, I can start to make my timber shelves. Firstly, I need to cut 3 lengths of my pre-primed timber at 1800mm long. The shelving will be made up in 2 sections, so make the inside piece to be 45mm, which gets attached to the wall. The timber dowel will protrude about 70mm past the first section of timber, so I'll need to cut 16 pieces of dowel at 115mm. Next, I label each shelf to avoid any mix-ups, and also mark which side is going to be the outside of the shelf. I'll go through and mark 50mm from each end of the timber, and then mark 425mm centers for the inside set out of the dowel locations. Each shelf will have 4 pieces of dowel connecting the 2 sections together. I'm using a 16mm speed bore on an extension driver to drill the dowel holes. It helps to use a piece of tape on the drill bit to give me a guide on how deep I need to drill. The holes need to be drilled as squarely as possible. What I'm doing is clamping a builder square onto my timber as a guide to help me drill squarely. Drill to the position of the tape on the speed bore. Make sure you go through and clean out the holes in the process of drilling them out. Once all the holes have been finished, the next job is to rip the timber into 2 sections. I'll use my combination square to mark a 45mm line along the timber. Next, I set up my circular saw to the correct depth, set the guide to the width, and then rip the timber along the 45mm line. For safety and ease of use, it's best to clamp the timber to the work stools while ripping, as you need to use both hands on the circular saw. The next step is to label all the timber shelving sections in the correct order to avoid any confusion. To help with the ease of installation, it's a good idea to lightly sand the 70mm protruding section of the dowel. This will help when we attach the 2 sections together. The next step is to add some PVA wood glue onto the dowel and hit the dowel into the 45mm section of the shelf from the back side. Repeat this process until all the dowel is attached into the first section of the timber. Next, I'll go through and make sure the shelving sections fit together correctly before the installation. give the shelves a good sanding. Sand the two sections of the shelving together to achieve a nice smooth finish. I then clamp the two sections together firmly, mark the positions of the dowel, and then pre-drill and install 30mm screws into the dowel to hold the two sections together. This screw will stop the sections from ever coming apart. I will now transfer the center stud positions from the wall set out onto the inside piece of our shelf. I'll go through and pre-drill 5mm holes in the timber frame locations in preparation to screw the inside section of the shelf to the wall. Now the floating shelf preparation is finished, it's time that we can screw the inside section of the shelf to the wall. To finish installing my floating shelves, all I need to do now is hold the shelves to the lines I marked on the wall earlier. I will then use the 100mm bugle screws to attach the inside section of the shelf to the wall using my pre-drilled holes that are lined up with the center of the timber wall frame. Once the inside section of the shelves are screwed into position, the next task is to slide the second section into position over the dowels. Match up each floating shelf pair as marked A, B or C, then slide into position. Be careful to make sure the shelves are in the correct order and the right way up. The second section should slide into position smoothly and fit against the first section tight. So yeah, that all worked pretty well. As you can see, it's all solid. Here we go, we have our 3 floating shelves installed. The only disappointing thing was when we screwed the back part of our shelf against the wall, pushed a bit of the gyprock out and put a bit of a bubble here and here. That's fine, I'll just cut that out, retape it, set it, give the shelves a final sand, and then I'll hit the shelves with semi-gloss woodwork paint to finish it all off, and then we're done. Due to the imperfection in the plaster, I'm going to give a light sand and then go through and apply a skim coat of plaster to achieve a nice result. I can now tighten the 30mm screws through the dowel to keep the timber sections tight together. I'll use a bit of spack filler to cover the screw holes in the shelves. I add the filler a bit proud so it can sand smooth. Now for the fun job of sanding all the plaster patching to be smooth. I always wear a mask as all dust is terrible for your lungs. I'll also sand all the spack filler and give the timber shelving a light sand also. Once all the sanding is finished, I'll give a quick vacuum to clean up most of the dust. I'll go through and do a bit of caulking between the intersection of the shelf and the wall. Use a plastic guide and a damp cloth to finish smooth. I spend a lot of time on the painting preparation to save time when I start to actually paint. Okay, now it's time to start painting. I begin with an undercoat primer on the plaster patches and one coat on all 3 of the floating shelves. I'm using a small 100mm roller to apply the priming paint. Next up, I paint the walls behind the floating shelves with the same colour as the rest of the house. The colour is a white shade called grayscale. The last step is to paint the floating shelves with 2 coats of a semi-gloss acrylic water-based enamel paint. This is a hard wearing finish that looks really nice. I'm using a small angled brush to cut in against the wall and then finishing off with a small roller. Okay, I've just finished the second coat of semi-gloss enamel to paint my timber shelves. I've gone through, patched the walls, done some touch-up painting. So I've got my 3 floating timber shelves finished. Just gotta wait for the paint to dry, then we can add some ornaments. This is the finished result of our floating shelves project. I'm really happy with how it's turned out. I think floating shelves using no brackets creates a nice clean finish. It's been a good project and a fun way to spend the weekend. The final job is to add a few finishing touches. I'm just going to add a few ornaments and photos to finish off the shelves. Here we go. I think that's a pretty nice result. To be honest with you, my fiance has been asking me to the maker of these floating shelves for years now. Finally, ran out of excuses and it became easier just to spend the weekend, make the shelves, install them, rather than coming up with excuses. It was originally a large timber bookshelf here, which was great. The only problem was that it took up quite a bit of floor space. By removing the bookshelf and installing these floating shelves, we were able to utilise a bit of extra floor space. As we live in a small house, every extra bit of floor space makes a big difference.
Now, that's the end of the project. I think we achieved a nice result, but let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd like to hear from you, and don't forget to hit the like button. Now I can stop working and get back to the beach. Thanks for watching.